The handcuffs clicked shut over a perfectly legal $100 bill. A piece of currency so authentic that 3 separate banks would later verify its legitimacy without hesitation. But in that single moment, Officer Bradley Harrison believed he had caught a criminal. He was about to learn that his arrogance would cost him everything. His career, his freedom, his reputation, his future. What he couldn't have known was that his decision to act on prejudice instead of procedure would set off a chain reaction that would expose the deep rot within his police department, that would force the city to reckon with accountability, and that would ultimately cost the taxpayers $2.4 million. This is the story of David Hayes, a 34-year-old architect with a quiet dignity that would refuse to bend even under the worst circumstances. It is the story of how one man's determination to fight injustice would transform not just his life, but the entire institutional framework designed to protect officers like Harrison from consequences. It started on an ordinary Friday afternoon in Dayton, Ohio, on a street that had never seen any reason to expect violence. The afternoon sun painted the pavement of Oak Ridge in long golden strokes as David Hayes pulled into the parking lot of Stanton's Market. His Subaru was clean, recently detailed, the kind of vehicle that suggested someone who paid attention to details, which made sense. David spent his professional life designing the structural details of buildings. At Vanguard Design, he was respected. More than respected, actually. He was the kind of architect that other architects wanted to work with. The kind who understood that buildings weren't just about aesthetics or profit margins, but about creating spaces where people could actually live their lives without fear. But today, David wasn't thinking about architecture. He was thinking about his daughter. Maya was turning 7 today. 7 years old. 7 years since Sarah had placed her newborn daughter into his arms in the hospital. 7 years since he had made a silent promise that he would never let her down. Never miss the important moments. Never be the kind of father who was too busy or too distracted to show up for the things that mattered. 7 years of birthday parties and school plays and scraped knees kissed better and nightmares soothed away. This year's party was happening at 4 o'clock in Sarah's backyard. Nothing elaborate. Sarah didn't believe in elaborate. And David respected that about her. She was one of those people who understood that children didn't need expensive performances to feel loved. They needed presence. They needed to know that the adults in their lives had shown up and paid attention. David had left Vanguard Design at 2:30, earlier than he normally would on a Friday. His colleagues had understood. They always understood when it came to Maya. There was something about fatherhood that made people more patient with each other, more willing to acknowledge that work wasn't actually the most important thing in the world, no matter what the emails suggested. The bakery had held the princess cake on special order, a delicate creation with 7 pink candles and frosting that looked like actual lace. Not expensive, but beautiful in the way that mattered. The kind of cake that made a 7-year-old feel seen and celebrated. David had also grabbed sparkler candles, the safe kind, the kind that wouldn't turn into a neighborhood fire hazard, and premium balloons in Maya's favorite colors, purple and silver. Everything was in the reusable canvas bag that he carried as he navigated the narrow, brightly lit aisles of Stanton's Market. The store was quiet, as it usually was on a Friday afternoon. The owner, Gregory Stanton, was a man in his late 50s with a permanent expression of suspicion etched across his face. He'd owned this place for 20 years, and in that time he had developed a particular way of looking at people, a squint that suggested he was always calculating whether they were about to steal from him, or scam him, or disappoint him in some other way. David had shopped here dozens of times over the past 2 years since moving to Oak Ridge. Stanton knew him, or he should have known him. At minimum, he should have recognized him as a regular customer, as someone who paid for things, as someone who wasn't a threat. But recognition and suspicion operated on different wavelengths in Stanton's mind. David set his items on the worn laminate counter. The cake box, the balloons, the sparkler candles. His smile was warm and polite. The kind of smile that said, "I'm just a regular person doing a regular thing. Nothing to worry about." He had spent enough years in professional settings to understand the power of that kind of smile. It was armor in a way. It was a signal. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just these, please," David said. His voice was steady, conversational. "And the princess cake from the back," Stanton grunted, the kind of non-committal sound that he seemed to make with most customers. He rang up the items one by one, still not making eye contact. The register totaled, comes out to $42.50. David reached into his leather wallet. It was a nice wallet, Italian leather, a gift from his mother years ago, and it spoke to the kind of financial stability that David had worked hard to achieve. He was not wealthy, but he was comfortable. He had a good job, a daughter he could provide for, a life that made sense. Earlier that morning, his grandmother had called him. She did this sometimes, called just to check in, to make sure he was taking care of himself and eating enough vegetables and doing okay, in the way that grandmothers worry about their grandsons. During the call, she had mentioned that she wanted to give Maya something special for her birthday, something from the old days, something with meaning. His grandmother had always been meticulous about money, in the way that people who had lived through economic uncertainty tend to be. She kept her savings in old shoeboxes, cash that she didn't trust to banks. She had given David a $100 bill, not a new one, but one from the 1990s, crisp and perfectly preserved despite its age. It was the kind of gift that carried weight beyond its monetary value. It was a gesture that said, "You're building something, you're doing well, I'm proud of you." That bill was now the first thing David pulled from his wallet. Gregory Stanton's fingers pinched the paper of that $100 bill with an immediacy that should have been David's first sign. Something was wrong. He didn't just take it, he stopped. His brow furrowed. That expression of suspicion that seemed to be his default setting. "There's no watermark on this," Stanton stated. And his voice had dropped an octave, laced with accusation. David's mind moved quickly through the facts he knew. His grandmother had explained this to him that morning, had even seemed a little amused by the worry that modern security paranoia had created around older currency. "It's an older series," David explained. His tone was calm, conversational. "Like this was just a factual discussion between two adults. 1990, I believe. My grandmother gave it to me this morning for Maya's birthday. They didn't print them with the large watermarks or the security threads back then, but Stanton was already moving past David's explanation. He pulled a counterfeit detection pen from beside the register, the kind that used iodine to test for starch content, a common security measure that had been in use for decades. The theory was simple. Real currency used a specific paper composition that wouldn't react with the iodine. Counterfeit bills, which were often printed on regular paper, would react. What Gregory Stanton didn't understand, and what David only vaguely understood, was a fact that would later become crucial to everything that followed. Older currency, having absorbed decades of environmental chemicals, or having been printed on paper batches with slightly different starch contents, frequently triggered false positives with standard iodine pens. It was a known issue in the currency verification community. It was something that anyone who had worked in banking for more than a few years would understand. Stanton uncapped the pen and slashed a thick yellow line across the portrait of Benjamin Franklin. The moment stretched. The iodine bloomed across the bill's surface, turning from yellow to a dark, muddy brown. To Stanton's eyes, eyes that had been primed by fear, by years of cynicism, by a fundamental distrust of people he didn't know, that dark line was absolute proof. To David's horror, in that single moment, everything changed. "I can't take this," Stanton said, stepping back from the counter and slipping the bill into his apron pocket with a possessive gesture. "And you're not leaving. I'm calling the police." David's pulse spiked. He could feel it in his chest, his heartbeat accelerating with a spike of adrenaline. His body had released it in response to danger. But he had lived 34 years on this earth, and he had learned long ago that panic was a choice, and that maintaining composure was often the only power available to him in situations like this. He kept his hands visible. He kept his voice steady. He wanted Stanton to hear him, really hear him, to understand that there was no threat in this interaction. "Mr. Stanton, please," David said. His tone was reasonable, the tone of someone trying to solve a problem, not someone trying to deceive. "It's real money. I can give you my credit card instead to pay for the cake, but I need that bill back. It's a gift from my grandmother. It's important to me." But Stanton wasn't listening. He had already made his decision. He was already moving, reaching under the counter to dial 911 with the kind of urgency that suggested he genuinely believed he was protecting his community from criminal activity. David heard Stanton's voice drop into a whisper, heard him describe a suspicious black male attempting to pass forged currency. And in that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere of the store. The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed harsher. The hum of the refrigeration unit suddenly seemed louder. The everyday sounds of a convenience store on a Friday afternoon suddenly took on a sinister quality, as if the space itself was conspiring against him. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:15 p.m. The party started at 4 p.m. Maya was probably already asking Sarah if Daddy was going to be there soon. She was probably putting on the dress they had picked out together last weekend, the purple one with the silver sequins that made her feel like a princess. She was probably asking what time the cake would arrive. He thought about that princess cake sitting in a box on the counter. He thought about the sparkler candles that he had just purchased. He thought about the balloons waiting to be inflated. He thought about the 7-year-old girl who had been promised a birthday celebration, and who would spend the next hours, how many hours he didn't know yet, waiting for a father who wouldn't show up. The bell above the glass door of Stanton's Market suddenly seemed impossibly far away. Within 4 minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the Friday afternoon traffic. The sound of sirens is a particular kind of sound. It cuts through everything else. It demands attention. It carries with it the weight of institutional authority. David had heard sirens before, in the normal way that people who lived in suburban neighborhoods heard sirens. But he had never had the experience of hearing those sirens in response to him, in response to something he had done, or was accused of doing. The police cruiser aggressively hopped the curb outside the market, tires squealing slightly against the asphalt. The light bar began painting the storefront in violent flashes of red and blue, the kind of colors that looked almost beautiful in their wrongness. in their absolute indicator of a situation going wrong. David made a decision in that moment. He decided that he would be cooperative. He decided that he would be clear and helpful and non-threatening. He decided that if he just explained the situation properly, if he just let the police officer understand what had actually happened, then everything would be fine. He decided that the system was designed to work, and that truth mattered, and that innocence was a defense. He would later understand how naive that decision was, but in that moment, standing in Stanton's market with his daughter's birthday cake on the counter, he believed that logic would prevail. The doors of the police cruiser swung open with the kind of violence that suggested the officers inside were moving with purpose and aggression, rather than caution and assessment. Out stepped Officer Bradley Harrison, a 12-year veteran of the Dayton Police Department, with a reputation that had been carefully cultivated through a dozen years of incidents that had somehow never resulted in any meaningful consequences. Harrison was the kind of officer who existed in a particular space within law enforcement, not quite incompetent enough to be fired, but not quite professional enough to be promoted. He was thick-necked and broad-shouldered, the kind of physical presence that he believed conveyed authority. He carried himself with a permanent, tight-jawed scowl that he genuinely believed was the expression of a serious police officer, not understanding that it mostly just made him look angry all the time. He was accompanied by his rookie partner, Officer Tyler Brooks, a 23-year-old fresh out of the academy, who still possessed the somewhat naive belief that police work was entirely about helping people and saving lives. Brooks was currently shifting uncomfortably in the passenger seat, sweating slightly through his uniform, largely because his training officer had been ranting for the past 20 minutes, ranting about the necessity of establishing dominance in interactions, about the importance of making sure that certain people understood who held authority in this town. Harrison burst through the door of Stanton's market with his hand already resting heavily on the grip of his service weapon, an intimidation tactic he used as naturally as breathing. His eyes locked instantly onto David. He did not assess the situation. He did not look at Stanton, did not ask for context, did not consider that there might be information he was missing. He saw a black man standing at a counter where a crime had been reported, and his prejudiced mind cemented the narrative before a single word was spoken. The narrative went like this: black man equals criminal, police call equals confirmation. His response, therefore, was predetermined. "Step away from the counter and put your hands behind your head," Harrison barked, his voice echoing off the canned goods and the refrigerated cases. The command was presented not as a request or even as an instruction, but as a non-negotiable assertion of authority. David's hands came up immediately, palms open, non-threatening. His body language was the textbook definition of compliance. He was trying to communicate with every movement. "I'm not a threat. I understand your authority. I will cooperate." "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding," David began, raising his hands slowly, keeping his palms open and unthreatening. I handed him an older $100 bill. "It's from 1990. My grandmother—" "I said, hands behind your head now," Harrison roared, cutting off David's explanation before it could even properly begin. His voice contained no curiosity, no openness to alternative narratives. It contained only command. Harrison closed the distance between them in 3 massive strides. Before David could properly interlace his fingers, Harrison grabbed him by the shoulder and violently spun him around, slamming his chest and face against the hard edge of the checkout counter. The display of breath mints and gum scattered across the linoleum floor, individual packages skittering across the tile. The impact hurt. David could feel the wind being knocked out of him, could feel the sharp pain of impact against his sternum, could taste something metallic that might have been blood in his mouth. "Hey, you're hurting him!" a middle-aged woman in the aisle yelled, pulling out her smartphone. "Back up! Police business!" Rookie Officer Brooks shouted, though he looked visibly uncomfortable with his partner's immediate escalation. His training had suggested that maybe they should hear the full story before slamming someone against a counter. But his training officer was clearly operating under different protocols. David gasped, the wind knocked out of him, his lungs struggling to reinflate. "Officer, my wallet is in my back pocket. My ID is in there. I'm an architect at Vanguard Design. The money is real. Take it to a bank." He was trying to give Harrison an off-ramp, a way out of this escalation, a way for both of them to preserve dignity. He was trying to offer facts and credentials, as if credentials mattered in a situation where the only thing that mattered was that Harrison had already decided David was guilty. "Shut your mouth," Harrison hissed directly into David's ear, aggressively wrenching David's left arm behind his back, in a movement that was entirely unnecessary, given that David was offering absolutely zero resistance. The metal handcuffs ratcheted tightly against David's wrists, biting deep into his skin, the cold metal a sensation that David would remember for the rest of his life. Harrison dug his knee into the back of David's thighs, establishing total physical dominance over a man who was offering absolutely zero resistance. It was domination for the sake of domination, the kind of excessive physical force that existed not because it was necessary to control the situation, but because it felt good to Harrison to assert that kind of power. Gregory handed the $100 bill to Harrison over the counter. Pen turned black, officer. He tried to scam me. Harrison held the bill, glancing at the dark mark with the kind of casual indifference that suggested the evidence didn't really matter. He'd already made his decision. The evidence was just theater. "Looks like you're going away for a while, counterfeiter," Harrison said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Federal offense." "Please," David pleaded, his voice muffled against the counter, his mind still trying to process the gap between what he understood the facts to be and what was actually happening. "Just run it through a proper scanner. Take it across the street to the Chase Bank. They will verify it. My daughter is waiting for me to bring her birthday cake." There was something in that statement. The reference to his daughter, to a birthday party, to a responsibility that existed outside this moment. That should have triggered something in Harrison. It should have suggested that maybe this was a man with something to lose, a man with stakes, a man who wasn't actually trying to commit federal crimes. It should have suggested that maybe the story was more complicated than the initial call had indicated. "The only place you're going is a holding cell," Harrison sneered, violently yanking David upright by the chain of the handcuffs, a movement that sent pain shooting through David's shoulders and neck. David bit his lip, refusing to give the arrogant officer any excuse to escalate the violence further. But there would be no escalation needed. The violence had already reached its intended level. The sheer indignity of the moment washed over David. He was a professional. He was a taxpayer. He was a father. And he was being treated like a violent street thug, over a gift from his grandmother, over a piece of currency that he had acquired through absolutely legitimate means. The walk from the front doors of Stanton's market to the back of the police cruiser felt like an eternity. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Neighbors who recognized David from his 2 years in the neighborhood watched in stunned silence. Strangers pulled out their phones, the red recording lights blinking ominously, capturing images of a calm handcuffed man being forced into the back of a police cruiser by an officer who was performing his authority, rather than exercising it. Harrison paraded David through this audience, a smug expression of authority plastered across his face. He forcefully shoved David's head down, a move that was designed to be humiliating, and to prevent David from maintaining any sense of dignity, practically throwing him into the suffocatingly hot, hard plastic back seat of the cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the ambient noise of the street, leaving David in a stifling, claustrophobic silence. His wrists throbbed from the handcuffs. The awkward angle of his restrained arms tore at his rotator cuffs with every bump in the road, as Harrison drove aggressively toward the precinct, driving with the kind of recklessness that suggested he was performing his authority, even for an audience that wasn't there. At the Dayton Police Department's precinct, Officer Bradley Harrison sat at his desk with his partner, Tyler Brooks, and began the process of memorializing his version of events in the official report. This report would become the foundation for everything that followed. This report would establish the narrative that the system would initially believe. This report would be the source of the lies that would later come back to destroy him. Harrison's fingers moved across the keyboard with the kind of confidence that came from a dozen years of writing reports that had never been seriously questioned. He described what never happened. He wrote about a violent struggle. He wrote about David resisting arrest. He wrote about David assuming an aggressive posture. He wrote about threats that were never made. Every single thing he wrote was a lie. Not an exaggeration, not a difference of interpretation. A deliberate, calculated lie, designed to cover his actions and to protect himself from accountability. Next to him, Tyler Brooks read the report over his shoulder. Brooks was new enough to still feel some discomfort. With the falsification of official documents, he shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure about whether he should say something. Clearly understanding that the video footage, if it existed, would show something very different from what Harrison had written. But Brooks said nothing. The protocols of police culture, the understanding that you backed up your partners even when they were lying, the fear of retaliation from officers you worked with every day, all of these things kept him silent. The report was filed, the narrative was set. David was officially documented as having violently resisted arrest, as having posed a threat that justified the physical force that had been used against him. The system would now move forward on the basis of this lie. David was processed and placed in a holding cell. The space was cold, with concrete walls that seemed to absorb sound, that seemed to amplify the sense of isolation and confinement. There was a metal bench, a toilet, and very little else. He had been allowed one phone call. He had called Sarah. Sarah, his best friend since college, the person who had been present at every important moment in his adult life, who had supported his decision to move to Oak Ridge, who had helped him plan Maya's birthday party. Sarah, who was now at her house, where balloons were supposed to be hanging, where a princess cake was supposed to be sitting on the table, where Maya was asking increasingly urgent questions about where Daddy was. David? Sarah's voice had been confused when she answered the phone. Confused because David wouldn't be calling at this time. Confused because his voice was going to tell her something bad. David, what's wrong? Where are you? Maya keeps asking. I've been arrested, David had said. and he could hear the silence on the other end of the line. The shock of that statement settling over her. It's a misunderstanding. They think the $100 bill my grandmother gave me is counterfeit. It's not. I tried to explain, but they wouldn't listen. I need a lawyer. Sarah, I need a really good lawyer. Oh my God, Sarah had said. David, what do I tell Maya? The cake. Everyone's already here. Her friends are here. What do I tell her? That had been the moment that broken something inside David. Not the violence, not the humiliation, not even the false arrest, but the realization that his 7-year-old daughter was asking where he was wondering why Daddy wasn't there for her, was being told some version of a lie because the truth was too complicated and too painful for a 7-year-old to understand. Tell her I'm working, David had said. And then the phone call had ended. Sarah had called Jonathan Croft, a defense attorney with a fearsome reputation in Dayton. Croft had a 94% case win rate. Croft had made a career of defending people against police misconduct. Croft had looked at the basic facts of David's case. Legal currency, false counterfeit pen test, arrest without probable cause, and said yes, he would take the case. But that night, sitting on the metal bench in the holding cell, David didn't know any of this. He only knew that his daughter was home without him, that his reputation was being destroyed, that his freedom was in the hands of a system that had already decided he was guilty. Jonathan Croft moved on Saturday morning with the kind of strategic precision that had made him successful over the years. He knew that the first 48 hours after an arrest were crucial. He knew that early intervention could make the difference between a case that collapsed quickly and a case that dragged on and destroyed his client's life. His first move was to request all security footage from Stanton's market. He served the subpoena on the store owner personally at 6 in the morning, before Gregory Stanton had even opened for business. The message was clear. This was serious. This was federal. This was not going to be dismissed easily. The security footage arrived at Croft's office by Saturday evening. Croft sat in his office with his paralegal and reviewed every second of the footage. What he saw was not a dangerous criminal resisting arrest. What he saw was a calm, cooperating man, with his hands visible, offering no resistance whatsoever, being violently assaulted by a police officer, who was clearly acting on prejudice rather than procedure. The video contradicted Harrison's official report, in every significant detail. Croft's second move was to take the $100 bill to 3 separate banks. Each one verified it immediately. Legal tender, authentic, no counterfeit. He also brought the bill to a chemist who tested the iodine pen, on other currency from the 1990s. The results were clear, false positive, a known issue with older currency. The evidence was building, and it was all pointing in the same direction. David was innocent, and Harrison had acted with prejudice. Croft's third move was more comprehensive. He requested Officer Harrison's personnel file from the city. What he found made his eyebrows rise. 14 excessive force complaints in 12 years. 14, not 1 or 2. The kind of complaints that might be misunderstandings, or the result of difficult situations. But 14, and of those 14 complaints, 11 involved minorities. 8 of the 11 involved black men and women specifically. None of the complaints had resulted in meaningful discipline. All of them had been dismissed or settled quietly by the police union, which seemed to have unlimited resources for protecting officers from accountability. The union had become a shield, an institutional force that allowed Harrison to continue his pattern of violence without facing consequences. But now something had changed. Now there was video evidence. Now there was a lawyer who knew how to use evidence. Now there was a client who had the support system to push back. By Sunday evening, Croft had assembled something that Harrison had never expected to be assembled. A complete picture of his behavior. Not just one incident, but a pattern. Not just one victim, but a series of incidents that suggested a deliberate targeting of minorities, a deliberate abuse of authority, a deliberate pattern of behavior that the institution had chosen to protect rather than correct. Croft also began investigating Harrison's background more thoroughly. He discovered something interesting. Harrison's younger brother owned a tow truck company that had contracts with the city. Harrison had connections. Harrison had leverage. Harrison had reasons to believe he was untouchable, but Harrison was about to discover something. That untouchable was not actually a permanent state. Untouchable depended on there being no consequences, and consequences were now very much on the horizon. On Monday morning, David was brought before Judge Patricia Higgins, a federal judge with a reputation for not tolerating police misconduct. The courtroom was not crowded. Sarah sat in the front row. David's supervisor from Vanguard Design sat nearby, and Jonathan Croft sat next to David, radiating the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have overwhelming evidence on your side. Croft presented the security footage to the court. Judge Higgins watched it. She watched David standing with his hands raised, open, non-threatening. She watched Harrison approach with aggression. She watched the unnecessary violence. She watched David offer no resistance whatsoever. She watched the moment when compliance was met not with de-escalation, but with increased force. The judge's expression did not change. But something had shifted. The case was no longer about a man's word against an officer's word. It was about video evidence versus a written lie. Croft called his chemist as a witness. The chemist explained in clear terms that even a jury would understand how iodine pens could produce false positives on older currency. He explained the specific chemistry involved. He explained that this was a known issue in the banking industry, that anyone who worked in currency verification would understand this. Stanton was called to the stand. Gregory Stanton, who had weaponized the police, who had made the initial call based on his own cynicism and suspicion, now had to sit in front of a judge and explain his actions. He admitted that he had not verified the bill through any other means. He admitted that he was not a currency expert. He admitted that he had immediately called the police, based on the results of a pen that he did not fully understand. He admitted, in essence, that he had acted on prejudice and suspicion, rather than on any actual evidence of criminal activity. The prosecution had no case. The evidence was too clear. The lie in Harrison's report was too obvious. When compared to the video footage, Judge Higgins delivered her ruling. Case dismissed with prejudice. Not just dismissed, but dismissed in a way that prevented it from being refiled. The dismissal carried with it an implicit condemnation of the police officer's actions. The judge ordered an immediate internal affairs investigation into Harrison's conduct. The judge directed that the case file be delivered to the district attorney for review on potential criminal charges. The victory, when it came, happened quickly. David was free. The charges were gone. The official narrative had been overturned, but everyone in the courtroom understood that this was just the beginning. The institutional response was about to begin, and it would be much larger than any individual case. Jonathan Croft made a strategic decision that would reverberate far beyond the courtroom. He leaked the security footage to every major news outlet in the country, simultaneously. By Tuesday morning, the footage was playing on national television, on an endless loop. A calm, professionally dressed man in a nice shirt and slacks, standing with his hands up, a police officer violently slamming him into a counter, for no apparent reason. The contrast between David's calm compliance and Harrison's explosive violence was stark and undeniable. The narrative went viral. Social media exploded with reaction. The contradictions between Harrison's official report and the actual video evidence were dissected and analyzed, and shared countless times. The story spread. A man arrested for legal currency, assaulted by a prejudiced officer. Vindicated by video evidence. The city of Dayton erupted. Protesters gathered outside the police precinct, demanding immediate accountability. The mayor, terrified of a federal civil rights investigation by the Department of Justice, immediately threw the police department under the bus. The police chief faced pressure. From above, from the mayor. And from below, from the community. For Harrison, the moment of reckoning had arrived. Chief Robert Sterling called Harrison into his office on Tuesday afternoon. Harrison walked in expecting the usual response. His union representative defending him, administrative leave being negotiated, the misunderstanding eventually blowing over, because the system was designed to protect officers like him. Instead, he found the chief standing behind his desk, alongside 2 detectives from the State Bureau of Investigation. "Turn in your badge and your weapon, Harrison," Chief Sterling ordered, his voice dripping with disgust. Sterling was old-school law enforcement, the kind of officer who believed that the uniform meant something. That authority carried with it responsibility. He had tried to push Harrison out for years, but had been blocked by the union. Now, with public pressure mounting and federal investigation on the horizon, he had the cover he needed. "Chief." "You can't be serious," Harrison scoffed, crossing his arms. "The guy tried to pass a fake bill. I reacted to the threat. It's standard procedure." Sterling turned a laptop screen around. It was playing the video of Harrison slamming David's face into the counter. It was playing David's face making contact with the counter. It was playing the impact, and then David standing there, not resisting, not struggling, not doing anything except standing there and absorbing the blow. "The Treasury verified the money, Bradley," Sterling said. And his use of Harrison's first name rather than his last name was a signal. This was personal. This was institutional judgment. It was real. You assaulted an innocent citizen. But worse than that, you lied on an official police report to cover it up. You documented a violent struggle that never happened. That is felony perjury. You disgraced this uniform, and you just cost the city millions. Before Harrison could even process the magnitude of his downfall, the state detectives moved in. The man who had callously slapped handcuffs on an innocent father just days prior was forced to turn around and put his hands behind his back. The metallic click of the cuffs echoed in the chief's office. Harrison was arrested. Perp walked out of his own precinct, in front of the very colleagues he had worked with for over a decade, and booked into the same holding cell where David Hayes had spent his agonizing weekend. He was formally indicted on charges of aggravated assault, official misconduct, perjury, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law, because his actions were proven to be maliciously outside the scope of his legal duties. The police union refused to cover his legal fees. Harrison's wife filed for divorce shortly after the indictment. She was not interested in standing by her man. Through a federal criminal trial, she was interested in protecting her assets and her future. She took their home and his remaining savings. In the divorce settlement, he was permanently stripped of his law enforcement certification. His pension was frozen, pending the outcome of his criminal case. He was facing up to 7 years in state prison. And given the strength of the evidence against him, and his prior pattern of violence, a conviction seemed almost inevitable. The collateral damage of Harrison's arrogance didn't stop with him, however. Gregory Stanton, the cynical store owner whose immediate assumption of guilt had started the entire nightmare, faced his own devastating reckoning. The local community, disgusted by the owner's role in the racist profiling, organized a massive and unrelenting boycott of Stanton's market. Delivery drivers refused to drop off inventory. Regular customers took their business down the street. The store that had been a neighborhood fixture for 2 decades became a symbol of how ordinary people could weaponize authority against other ordinary people, based on nothing more than fear and suspicion. Within 3 months, drowning in debt and completely ostracized by the neighborhood he relied on, Stanton was forced to board up his windows and declare bankruptcy. He lost the business he had built over 20 years, all because he had chosen to weaponize the police, instead of making a simple phone call to a bank. The cascade of consequences didn't end with Harrison. The video evidence and the revelation of his pattern led the police department to begin a deeper investigation of their own practices. What they found made the institutional problems impossible to ignore. 3 other officers showed similar complaint patterns. The complaints had never resulted in meaningful discipline. The union had protected them consistently. The institution had enabled escalating behavior. It was no longer possible to characterize this as a bad apple problem. This was institutional. This was a deliberate choice by the organization to protect certain officers from accountability. The mayor called for an emergency city council meeting. The police chief faced intense scrutiny. There was pressure from the federal government, which had announced an investigation into the Dayton Police Department's patterns and practices. The city's legal department ran the numbers and realized they were facing potentially catastrophic liability. Taking a case like this to trial, with the video evidence so clear and the pattern of misconduct so obvious, would not only result in a massive financial loss, but would permanently scar the city's reputation. They began settlement negotiations with Jonathan Croft. The negotiations were intense and unrelenting. Croft knew he had leverage. He had the viral video, he had the authenticated currency, he had Harrison's perjured police report, he had the federal investigation hovering over the city's head. He had 11 officers with similar complaint patterns. He had evidence that the institutional failure was deliberate. The city's legal department looked at all of this and realized they had absolutely zero defense. They had absolutely no way to win this in court. After weeks of negotiation, the city of Dayton capitulated completely. They agreed to pay David Hayes an unprecedented settlement of $2.4 million. Not just a settlement, but an admission of institutional wrongdoing. Not just a payment, but a commitment to real reform. The settlement included mandatory body camera activation at the beginning of any officer interaction, with footage released to the public within 72 hours. The settlement included the elimination of complaint quotas that had incentivized officers to make arrests they might not otherwise have made. The settlement included the establishment of a civilian review board with genuine subpoena power, not the kind of toothless board that existed in many police departments, but the kind that could actually investigate and hold officers accountable. The settlement included the appointment of a federal monitor to oversee the police department's practices for the next 2 years, to ensure that the institution was genuinely moving in the direction of accountability. The day the settlement was finalized, David and Sarah sat at their kitchen table, staring at the incomprehensible number on the bank statement. $2.4 million. It was the kind of number that didn't feel real. That seemed almost too large to represent actual money. Is it enough? Sarah asked. To fix what happened? David was quiet for a long moment. The money could never erase the trauma of that dark weekend in the holding cell. The money could never wash away the memory of the cold steel biting into his wrists. The money could never undo the fact that his 7-year-old daughter had spent the night wondering where her father was. But it was something. It was tangible proof that the system, though deeply flawed and stacked against him, could be forced to bend to the truth, when that truth was undeniable and public. It's a start, David said finally. The settlement included a commitment to broader reform. City Council voted on Ordinance 2024-156, which formalized the policies that the settlement had mandated. Mandatory body cameras would activate automatically at the beginning of any officer interaction. No discretion, no opportunity to claim a camera malfunction. The footage would be released publicly within 72 hours, creating a built-in accountability mechanism. That made it harder for officers to claim that their actions were taken in self-defense. When video proved otherwise, complaint quotas were eliminated entirely. Officers could no longer be evaluated or compensated based on the number of arrests they made or citations they issued. This removed the financial incentive to manufacture crimes. or to target specific neighborhoods based on profitability. A civilian review board was established with genuine authority, not merely an advisory body that could be ignored, but a board with subpoena power, with the ability to investigate complaints, with the ability to recommend discipline directly to the chief. Annual bias training became mandatory for all officers. Not the kind of training that was forgotten before officers even left the classroom, but training that was mandatory, that was enforced, that was documented, and that would be repeated every year. A federal monitor was appointed to oversee compliance. With all of these measures for 2 years, the monitor would file quarterly reports that would be made public. There would be no hiding accountability behind closed doors. The vote passed 7-2. 2 city council members voted against the ordinance, claiming that it was too aggressive, that it punished the entire police department for the actions of one officer. But they were outvoted. The institution was being forced to change. Harrison was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in state prison. His plea deal acknowledged guilt on all counts. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. His life as he had lived it was finished. David Hayes, meanwhile, used the settlement to create something new. He established a college trust fund for Maya. $250,000 that would be sitting there, waiting for her when she was ready to attend college. Money that would mean she could focus on learning, rather than worrying about how to pay tuition. Money that was a tangible symbol of the fact that her father had fought for justice, and that fight had borne fruit. He invested heavily in his architectural firm, finally taking the leap to become a senior partner. The financial stability allowed him to do the kind of architecture he had always wanted to do, designing buildings that would last, that would serve communities. That would be more than just profitable investments. He also quietly donated a substantial sum to legal aid organizations dedicated to helping individuals who couldn't afford a powerhouse lawyer, like Jonathan Croft. When the system turned its terrifying sights on them, he understood in a way that only someone who had been through this experience could understand, that his victory was not universal. Most people arrested on false charges didn't have the resources to fight back. Most people didn't have a best friend like Sarah, or a lawyer like Croft. Most people spent years in the system fighting for justice, and never obtained it. His case became a precedent. Other people who had been harassed or arrested by officers with similar patterns of misconduct used David's case as evidence in their own fights for justice. 2 more officers were terminated. 3 more officers were suspended. The pattern that had been invisible before was now visible, documented, and undeniable. The institutional response was slow, but it was real. The ordinance was implemented. The body cameras were installed. The footage was released. The civilian review board met regularly and received complaints. The federal monitor filed quarterly reports that showed progress. Would the system have changed without David's willingness to fight? Almost certainly not. The system had been protecting officers like Harrison for years. The cycle would have continued indefinitely if someone hadn't been willing to stand up and challenge it publicly. 6 months after the settlement, on a bright, peaceful Saturday afternoon, David walked into a high-end bakery downtown. He was wearing a sharp suit, confidence visible in his posture. He had lost the haunted quality that had lingered. In the weeks after his arrest, he had processed the trauma, worked through it, and emerged on the other side, understanding that he had survived something that was designed to break him. And he had not been broken. He walked up to the counter and smiled at the friendly clerk. "I'm here to pick up a cake," David said softly. "A princess cake for my daughter." The clerk smiled. No suspicion in her expression. No counterfeit pen being pulled from beneath the counter. Just a simple, straightforward commercial transaction. Between 2 people who recognized each other's basic humanity, he paid with a brand new, crisp $100 bill. It had the modern 3D security ribbon and the prominent watermark. It had all of the modern security features that made it impossible for any counterfeit pen to misidentify it. The clerk handed him his change and wished him a wonderful weekend. David walked out of the store, the heavy box secure in his hands. The significant aspect of this moment wasn't just that David was able to buy his daughter a birthday cake without harassment. It wasn't even the $2.4 million settlement, or the career advancement, or the college fund he had established. The significant aspect was that the system had changed. The infrastructure of accountability had been put in place. The cameras were recording. The civilian board was reviewing complaints. The federal monitor was filing reports. The ordinance was being enforced. Officers knew they were being watched. Officers knew that their actions were being documented. Officers knew that the historical pattern of protection, where the union and the institution would defend them no matter what, was no longer guaranteed. Would racism disappear from law enforcement? Would prejudice vanish from the culture of policing? Would institutional bias be completely eliminated? No. These were cultural problems that ran deeper than any single ordinance or any single settlement. But there was now a mechanism. There was now accountability. There was now a path for victims to obtain justice, a path for evidence to be examined, a path for institutional failures to be exposed and corrected. David sat in his office at Vanguard Design, reviewing architectural plans for a new community center that the city was building. The community center would be named after a local activist who had fought for police reform for decades. It would be a symbol. of the community's commitment to healing after years of institutional trauma. His phone rang. It was another client, someone who had been stopped by a Dayton police officer and wanted to know if they had a case, if they had grounds to file a complaint, if they had any hope of justice. David listened to their story. He heard echoes of his own experience in their words, the suspicion, the aggression, the feeling of being treated as guilty, before innocence was even considered. When the call ended, he sent them Jonathan Croft's contact information and a message. You have a case. Fight! The cameras were recording. The civilian board was reviewing complaints. The federal monitor was watching. The ordinance was in effect. The system had changed. Would it be enough? Would justice always be served? Would the outcome always be as clear and vindicated as David's had been? No. The system was still imperfect, still capable of failure, still sometimes protecting the wrong people. But it was better. It was measurably better, and measurably better was sometimes all you could get when you were fighting against institutions that had been designed to protect themselves. David's willingness to fight, combined with undeniable video evidence and public pressure, had bent the arc of the system towards something more like justice. Not perfect justice, but justice nonetheless. As the afternoon sun moved across his office windows, David thought about Maya, about her growing up in a city where the police were watched, where the system had to justify itself, where accountability was real. He thought about the other children growing up in that same city. Who would benefit from the changes that his fight had forced into existence? He thought about that $100 bill from his grandmother, about how a simple act of commerce had turned into a battle against institutional racism and corruption. He thought about how one person, standing firm, refusing to accept injustice, could force a system to change. The system still had problems. It still wasn't perfect. But now there was light shining on those problems, and light was the first step toward actual change. The Dayton Police Department's complaint history before and after the ordinance tells a story. Before Ordinance 2024-156, the average resolution time for a complaint was 247 days. After the ordinance, with the federal monitor in place and the civilian board reviewing cases, the average resolution time dropped to 83 days. Accountability wasn't just faster, it was visible. The number of excessive force complaints actually increased initially. After the ordinance was implemented, this wasn't because the police department had suddenly become more violent. It was because the new system made it easier for victims to file complaints, and it made the complaints actually matter. Before, filing a complaint was an exercise in frustration. After filing a complaint was the beginning of a process that could lead to actual change. 3 of those complaints resulted in officer terminations. 5 resulted in suspensions. Dozens resulted in mandatory retraining. Officer Harrison's conviction was upheld on appeal. He served his full 5-year sentence before being released into a world where his name was known, where his actions were documented in a national database of law enforcement misconduct, where employment in law enforcement was permanently closed to him. Jonathan Croft continued practicing law, using David's case as a template for fighting police misconduct cases in other jurisdictions. He won 73 more cases in the years following David's victory, helping other victims obtain justice and forcing other institutions to change their practices. Stanton's market was eventually taken over by a new owner who had a different approach to business, one that was based on trust rather than suspicion, one that was based on understanding community rather than policing it. The store reopened and became a symbol of community resilience rather than community trauma. Maya Hayes grew up understanding that her father had fought for something important, that he had stood against injustice. Even when standing against injustice was terrifying, she became involved in criminal justice reform work as she got older, driven by the knowledge that the system could be forced to change through persistence, through evidence, through refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they were. And the cameras kept recording. The federal monitor kept filing reports. The civilian board kept reviewing complaints. The ordinance that had been forced into existence, through David's determination to fight, remained in place, creating a foundation for accountability that hadn't existed before. One man's refusal to accept injustice, one man's decision to fight back, one man's insistence that the truth mattered, and that systems could be forced to acknowledge that truth. That had changed everything. Thank you for watching this story of persistence, resilience, and the power of evidence to expose injustice. If you found this story compelling, if it moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of refusing to accept what we're told to accept, without question, please subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these stories of accountability and justice to audiences everywhere.